Our guest on Newsmakers this week is Michael Needham. He is the CEO, founding CEO of Heritage Action for America. The group started in 2010, and it is a policy advocacy organization linked to the Heritage Foundation here in Washington. Nice to have you with us this week.
Thanks for having me.
Let me introduce our two reporters who will be asking questions of Mr. Needham. Neil King is national political reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and Karen Tumulty has the same role at the Washington Post. And Karen, you're up first with a question.
Well, great. Well, let's start with the new year. We're going into an election year here. And the new health care law is really sort of finally kicking fully into gear. And it looks like on the Hill, the new year is going to begin with fights over minimum wage and long-term unemployment. What are the issues that you guys are going to be watching most closely, and which ones do you think are going to matter the most come November?
Well, I think in November, Obamacare is going to be overwhelmingly the top issue. And you basically have two parties at this point. One who in October was willing to do everything it could to try to stop this bill from going forward, knew that socialized medicine wasn't going to work, knew that this bill had all sorts of fundamental flaws, and tried to stop it. Another party that was willing to do everything it could to make sure that the bill went forward. And when you see all of the implications of it, stuff that we knew before the implementation started in terms of job loss, in terms of full-time workers going to temporary workers, premiums going up, and certainly what's gone on in the last couple of months in terms of the federal government not being able to implement a project of this magnitude that's impacting 1/6 of the economy. I think November is going to fundamentally be about this difference between one party, which is the party of Woodrow Wilson's progressivism, and another party, which is the party of a more limited government as articulated by our founders. And that's going to be a good dynamic for, I think, the conservative party.
Now, the Democrats are saying, though, that they're going to be able to play offense, both on the minimum wage and on long-term unemployment benefits. How involved in this are you guys going to get?
Well, we'll certainly monitor everything that's going on Capitol Hill. We're an organization that tries to inform the country what's going on in Washington and what their elected members of Congress are doing. I think on unemployment insurance, when you look at something like that, the data shows that extended unemployment insurance causes unemployment to be higher. It causes people to put off looking for work and finding work. And so we think that 26 weeks is better for the country, is better for people than 99 weeks. But those are fights that will develop over the course of this month and this year as we go forward.
But what about minimum wage? I mean, that's something that's hugely popular among all voters, but I think it even gets a bare majority among Republicans.
Well, I think that you have to look at the policy issue. The presidents could try to spin this and make this into a messaging thing. At a time when Applebee's is delivering food menus on an iPad, letting you order from your own table, raising a minimum wage is going to have an impact on jobs. There's a great article up in New York, or there's a sad article up in New York that looked at a project that was being built in the Bronx, and there was a plan to have 1,200 jobs created through that project. And unfortunately, the kind of higher minimum wage that was being applied to that project caused the project to be killed, and a new project that met the minimum wage only creates 250 jobs. And so this is a disagreement about whether it's better to have 250 jobs that pay slightly more than 1,200 jobs, or whether it's better to have more jobs out there. I think even Ezra Klein recently wrote, he said, look, full employment is a worthy goal, a better goal than necessarily solving some of these other issues that are out there.
Let me just ask a question looking back a little bit. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the last quarter of 2013 was not necessarily a great quarter for the conservative movement per se, or for your group. The government shutdown, which you all helped orchestrate in many ways, was seen as a debacle by a lot of people, even within the party. The party's ranking or sort of approval rating dropped to the lowest level in your lifetime anyway for a very long time, and going back to the beginning of our polling. You obviously had a lot of falling out with Speaker Boehner. There was even a lot of Republicans that sort of decided to distance themselves from Heritage. I mean, how do you look at what transpired in the last 3 months, and whether it wasn't sort of a bruising time for you and your organization?
Well, I don't think there have been that many Republicans who have distanced themselves from Heritage. Look, I think that at the end of the day, a government shutdown was caused by the president, who wanted to make sure that everything possible was done to make sure Obamacare went forward. And I think that every single day, as we're seeing the problems with Obamacare, the fundamental flaws with the progressive vision for America that he has and that he's turned into law, more and more people are looking at conservatism as something that's admirable. 72% of the American people don't like the Republican Party. I'm one of those right now. The Republican Party needs to find its soul. It needs to find who it stands for. And when most Americans look at Washington, D.C., they see a game and they see pretend food fights. They're about making sure that well-connected people who can hire lots of lobbyists have the tax code written in their favor, have the spending and have regulations written in their favor, but that if you're a small business person or you're an entrepreneur or you're somebody who just wants to go to work and then go home to your family, you don't have a voice in Washington.
But aren't you guys, in a way, a part of the game? I mean, you score members. That score games and scores go together. I mean, you're very much a part of the process, scoring members, and at least a lot of Republicans say, you know, stirring things up within the party in ways that aren't necessarily always constructive.
So we ask tough questions of members of Congress, and we inform their constituents of the answers to those questions, which sounds a lot like what both of you do. We have opinions on pieces of legislation that go forward. We thought that it was a bad deal when Paul Ryan and Patty Murray cut a deal to both raise spending and raise taxes. We put out our argument for that, and we told constituents it. And I think that it is good for democracy for members of Congress to go home, have a more well-informed constituency, get tough questions from reporters and constituents, and have to answer them. And that's what we're doing. And I get that it's frustrating to a lot of people in Washington. It's easier when there's fewer people talking to your constituents, when you can frame a farm bill that's 80% food stamps as just about agriculture policy that benefits our district. But one of the things that we found, I think there was an article in the Wall Street Journal actually going to some of these farm districts and saying, look, there's people who said, I don't need a farm bill if it's 80% food stamps and if it's having this gargantuan cost to the taxpayer. And the more people who are out there asking those tough questions, the better it is for our democracy. So
what do you think were the Speaker's motives in deciding to take on your organization so directly? It was really sort of an extraordinary moment for him.
Well, I don't know. It's probably a better question for him. I think that at the end of the day, the Republican Party, the conservative movement, and Washington should be big enough to be able to have fact-based policy disagreements. There were good people, Paul Ryan included, who thought that cutting this deal, given the environment that existed in December, was the right thing to do for their country, and I don't begrudge them that opinion. I disagree with it. When we looked at the deal, the alternative that we saw, keeping the sequester, while imperfect, was better. And I think that this country should be strong enough that we can have those disagreements.
And do you consider John Boehner part of the conservative movement?
Sure, I consider John Boehner calls himself a conservative. I think he's a great conservative, and I've disagreed with some play calls that he's made as Speaker, and we've articulated our disagreements with him.
You know, I was nosing around, and there's been a lot written about you and about Heritage Jackson in the last few months. The New Republic, not exactly a conservative publication, but they said that they were talking about Heritage Foundation because of Heritage Action, having gone from an august conservative think tank revered by Washington Republicans to the party's loathed ideological commissar, which are probably kind of tough words. I mean, do you see yourself as a sort of ideological commissar within the Republican Party?
No, look, I think that unfortunately in Washington, D.C. today, which is very different from Washington, D.C. 40 years ago when the Heritage Foundation was started, there are so many pernicious influences, the need to raise millions of dollars for campaigns, 33,000 lobbyists on K Street, that make it very difficult to advance good principled legislation. And one of the things that we're trying to do is go over the heads of Washington, D.C., directly to constituents and talk about the types of bold ideas that could make America better. And I think when you look at an idea that the Heritage Foundation developed in conjunction with Mike Lee to change the higher education accreditation process, where you just have a terrible situation in this country right now, over $1 trillion of student loan debt, the amount of money the average college graduate comes getting out of college going down year over year over year, many people being forced to get a 4-year degree when in fact they don't need a 4-year degree, and the student loan responsibilities that come with that. We need to change the accreditation process. That's a very difficult thing to be bold enough to change if you're in the pockets of lots of K Street lobbyists or you're in the pockets of a lot of influential universities with billion-dollar endowments. Mike Lee, I think somebody who's been willing to shake up Washington, been willing to take on the establishment, is somebody who can put forth those bold ideas.
It's interesting, though, because Mike Lee has undergone a real conversion of sorts. I know some of this. Pardon me?
I don't think that's true.
Well, yeah, okay, we could argue that. But I know that some of this he's talked about well before the shutdown. But after the shutdown, he really rolled out this whole series of interesting, gnarly, kind of crunchy, positive ideas. And he's been out saying, we can't be the party of no. We have to know how to say yes. We have to have an affirmative agenda. But at the same time, it's interesting because Heritage Action is mainly known as sort of a repeal, overturn, reject kind of organization. I mean, do you agree with him that the Republican Party really needs to find an affirmative, positive agenda to win not only this year but in 2016?
There are as many bold ideas that have come out of the Heritage Foundation over the last couple of years and out of Mike Lee over the last couple of years as any other institution or senator that you'll find out there. The Heritage Foundation created something 3 years ago called our Saving the American Dream Plan. Totally looked at the entire federal government, defense, Social Security, Medicare, said if you were starting from scratch and you were looking at the responsibilities of government and society towards individuals, what would a modern Social Security system look like? What would modern foreign policy look like? Mike Lee took that plan, he turned it into a budget. It was voted upon. Unfortunately, in Washington, D.C. today, it only got 17 votes, which is probably an indication of why so many people look at Washington, D.C. and frown. But I think that if you're willing to take on the status quo bias of this town, if you're willing to look and say, look, there's a lot of things that are good policy, but they don't have constituencies amongst the well-connected lobbyists in Washington, and you're willing to take on those influences, you can have big, bold ideas. And I'm proud of all the great ideas.
But do you share this concern of this sort of party of no idea, that the Republican Party has become seen too much as like a sort of rejectionist, repeal, overturn kind of party?
No, look, the Republican Party needs to stand for big, bold ideas. And there are many institutions out there that have big, bold ideas, and we need to embrace them. Washington, D.C. is the city of no right now. And so you can't get fundamental tax reform put through the Ways and Means Committee because there's so many different people who want to preserve their carve-out that it can't get done. Tom DeLay, one of the first experiences I had in this town was Tom DeLay coming out and saying there's no fat left in the federal government, which is on its face absurd, but what he actually meant was true. It's that every single dime of the federal budget has been spoken for by some well-connected interest in Washington, D.C., and there was nowhere left to cut if you believed in the K Street project, if you believed in those interests. And so I think what we need, if the Republican Party wants to become more bold, if the Democrat Party wants to become more bold, if our federal government wants to become more bold, is a willingness to start with a blank sheet of paper and say, what should these programs look like for the 21st century? And unfortunately, Washington doesn't yet seem to be ready to do that.
So, speaking of big, bold ideas, immigration's being talked about again, the potential for some kind of movement. What do you think the Republican Party needs to do on immigration to assure its own survival in a country that is becoming increasingly diverse?
Yeah, we need to modernize our immigration system. We need to have an immigration system that says we welcome people from all around the world to come to this country, to contribute to this country, and to have jobs. I think, unfortunately, you only get one chance every 10, 15, 20 years to do big, bold immigration reform.
But what about the ones who are here?
What's that?
What about the ones who are here?
There's all sorts of problems that need to be looked at in our immigration system. You don't do something as big and bold and comprehensive as immigration reform if you have a President of the United States that I think has demonstrated ill faith in how he wants to use this issue for political means and not for getting good policy. We can all agree, many people can agree, that we need to increase the number of H-1B visas. Why don't the Democrats want to put forth that bill? Actually, the 112th Congress, Republicans in the House, passed a bill to increase H-1B visas. That should be something that we can agree to settle on. I support a guest worker program. I think that we should have some sort of program where people can come in, work for a limited period of time, and then go home, which is what many people want to do.
So do you believe
and I think
that
once you start fixing the imbalance in the labor markets that currently exists, security becomes easier to do. You build up trust with the American people, and there may be a time in the future where you then say, now that we've fixed the system, what do we do about the people who are here right now?
So you then would back some sort of incremental approach that some in the House obviously are talking about that would keep the amnesty sort of, or anything related to amnesty, off to the side?
Well, it depends. I think that right now, with the President of the United States going forward, I think he's been pretty clear, and I suspect that it'd be very difficult to get much immigration reform done that doesn't include some sort of amnesty, and we're against that. I think going forward, the right way to do it, if there was good faith, if there were people who were trying to solve problems, is to look incrementally at what can we do to fix the system, start improving the lack of matching between labor supply and labor demand.
But I know that you're on record saying that you don't think that there will be any overturning or repealing of Obamacare until 2017. It seems you're sort of suggesting that even some bigger fix to the immigration system is not going to be possible until after this president is out of office.
I don't think you could get a modern immigration system from this president. I think a modern immigration system would include a guest worker program. Well, he doesn't want that because guest workers don't sign up for labor unions. That's not an environment in which you can get good policy. And so I think we should wait until we have a policy environment which is more conducive to actually solving the problem rather than just passing a bill.
And does that suggest then that in the interim you're willing to sort of accept the fact that essentially most of the Latino vote will remain out of reach of the Republican Party?
Well, I don't think that any group votes purely based on one issue, and I certainly don't think that's true of the Latino vote or anything else. I think
But whatever issue set you have out there now, they're not voting for Republicans.
I think the notion that simply by passing amnesty and letting Barack Obama be the president that signed amnesty, all of a sudden Latinos are going to look at the Republican Party and say, there's the party that speaks for me, is pretty foolish, and it's in some ways insulting to people who look at an entire array of issues, who have all sorts of concerns and need a party that speaks for them. Look, current Republican Party voters have big problems with the Republican Party. It shouldn't be surprising that this is a party that struggles to attract new people to it. And I think we should start looking at what are the fundamental flaws with Washington, D.C., with both parties in Washington, D.C., that cause so many Americans to feel disenfranchised from the system. And I think the first party to get to a position where it says, you know what, you're right. If you're a small person, and if you can't hire a team of lobbyists, you don't have much voice in Washington, D.C. right now, and we're going to be the party that tries to fix that. We'll appeal to all sorts of different groups and new demographics, and its current demographic, in a way that I think both parties right now struggle to do.
You know, you started out saying, portraying this year, there are two parties, they took these two different views on Obamacare, but in many ways, the last year or two has been kind of a story about an infighting within the Republican Party that almost suggests that there are more than two parties. I mean, you've talked about how there's the inside versus the outside when it comes to the Republican Party, or the establishment versus the activists, that there's sort of a group that's different from the Republican Party. You said yourself that you are among the 72% that doesn't like the Republican Party. So talk a little bit just about what's going on within the party and whether there isn't sort of a group that's sort of like clamoring to break out of that would be purer and of a different identity.
Well, I don't think anyone's looking to break out. I think that there is a healthy policy debate going on right now within the Republican Party that looks at all sorts of issues and says, look, are we better off trying to do the best job that we can within the current framework that exists in Washington, D.C., or do we need to start recognizing some fundamental problems that exist in this town? When I look at Washington, D.C., it is a town that does everything it can to stifle bold ideas, to stifle outside-the-box thinking, and is perfectly happy to continue the status quo through the next election, through the job you have after being a member of Congress, to make sure that you have people who are giving you the PAC checks that you need to raise millions of dollars for your campaign.
With Republicans being just as guilty of that as...
With both parties, unfortunately, being caught in a system that is not conducive to bold ideas. Most Americans, I think, intuitively get that. That's why Washington, D.C. has such low approval ratings. If the Republican Party wanted to grasp on to some big, bold conservative ideas, said, look, we're going to fundamentally reform the tax code. There's going to be a lot of people in Washington, D.C. who are upset about that. But at the end of the day, you're better off in a business environment that has a tax code that is simple, is fair, is as low as it possibly can be while funding the necessary functions of the government. And we're going to fight for that. And that's going to be better because a lot of people can't afford to hire a team of lobbyists and tax accountants to figure out how to get their marginal rate down to zero.
Now, nothing defines a party like a nominee's. Who, in light of what you just said, excites you when you think of 2016?
Well, I think the whole field excites me. And I think that when you look at the types of people who are going to run in 2016, there's a great diversity. There's just lots of energy and invigoration that will be in that field, and I think it'll be very healthy to watch that debate go forward and to see what happens.
No one excites you more than anyone else?
Well, I think, what excites me the most is if you look at every single Republican nominee since Ronald Reagan, with the exception of John McCain, they all opposed Ronald Reagan in 1980. So you had George H.W. Bush, who opposed Ronald Reagan. You had Bob Dole, who ran against him in 80. You had W., who supported his father. You had Mitt Romney, who was an independent at the time of Reagan and Bush. We now have the generation that was brought up seeing Ronald Reagan, that believes it. The party of Reagan will have people running in 2016 who had their formative years, let it be Ted Cruz, who was 10 years old. Chris Christie, I think, was around 20 years old. Everybody else kind of in that frame, all competing to give the American people the inspirational message that conservatism has and can show how limited government and civil society can make life better for everybody.
6 minutes left.
How is Heritage Action feeling about Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader, these days?
I think that you can go to our scorecard at heritageaction.com, and what we do is we very transparently, for every member of Congress, list all the votes that we thought was important, why we thought they were important, and how they voted. And I think that it's the job of the constituents, not me, to look at that scorecard and look at the overall score, the details of the various votes, and say, is this person doing a good job or a bad job?
But beyond that, I mean, these scorecards, I mean, this is not a static process in terms of, you know, trying to marshal resources in that race. What are you guys going to do? Well,
so we're not involved in electoral accountability. What we're doing is providing legislative accountability, asking tough questions, informing voters of those tough questions so that they can ask them back home in their district. And I think that it's the job of every senator, every member of the House, to go home, talk to their constituents about what they've achieved in Washington, and answer those questions.
There's at least some opportunities for some fun brinksmanship, like we saw a lot of last year. The debt ceiling debate will be one particular. Do you see would you support there being some, you know, holding feet to the fire in ways that could be, you know, maybe not great for Republicans in an election year?
Well, I take a step back. Why do we have a debt limit? Why did Congress decide in 1912 to institute a debt limit, which many countries don't have, you don't need to have?
Fund World War I, basically.
To fund World War I, say we need to have, there's the Second Liberty Bond Act, and they said we're going to take on some debt, and at the same time we're going to install a fire alarm in our house that goes off at various set increments and forces a conversation about whether we've taken on too much debt. Now, there's a sense in Washington, this is the status quo bias that we were talking about before, that every time the smoke alarm goes off, we just need to turn it off, take off the battery, and spend some more money. I think that the reason we have that, it should be used, is to debate, okay, we need to increase the debt limit. There's no way we're going to balance our budget overnight. But what types of spending changes are we going to make to start getting the situation under control? And I think both when you look at what's called brinksmanship, the debt limit, but also the annual appropriations process that our Constitution gives, these are checks on having government on autopilot and saying on an annual basis, we're going to look at all the spending in the appropriation bills and decide whether or not we want to go forward, increase, decrease, what we want to do. It's part of a healthy system of government to have that check.
But how hard a bargain do you want Republicans to push on that?
Well, I think they talked last year about getting our country on a path to balance, and I think that if you're raising the debt limit, you should be implementing the types of policies which get our nation over 10 years to a balanced budget. Most families do that. It's responsible. It's not responsible to have $17 trillion of debt, which is what we have right now. And so I think that any increase of the debt limit needs to be accompanied by spending cuts that start getting our country towards that path to balance.
What's your number one focus this year, particularly in this session? Like, what are you going to zero in on?
Well, I think that for the Republican Party, for conservatives to prosper over time, we need to show, as we were talking about earlier, that we're the party of bold ideas. And I think that when you look this summer at a higher education reaccreditation renewal, that's a great opportunity to show how we can change the broken accreditation process in this country and empower people. When you look at the Export-Import Bank, which is the purest form of corporate cronyism out there, ending that, which the House has the power to do, is an example to show that we're not the party of Washington, we're the party of the people. I think when you look at the debt limit and you look at these appropriation bills and getting spending under control, these are important things. And so this is an opportunity, last year was, this year was, for the Republican Party to show that conservative policies are, in fact, the soul of that party. And that's what we're pushing.
Are you going to go positive to some extent? And when you're talking about the accreditation thing, that's more of a kind of affirmative thing, the sort of thing that Mike Lee is talking about. Are you going to?
Well, I think we've been positive the whole time, right? So a lot of people last year, there was a big blow-up over the Farm Bill. And historically, for the last 50, 60 years, there's been this unholy alliance between inner-city people who care a lot about food stamps, people from square states that care a lot about farm programs that have kind of made sure that status quo, broken agriculture and food stamp policy goes forward year over year. It was perceived as negative that we were opposed to a continuation of that, but we would love nothing more than to sit down with the Ag Committee and say, look, what does a modern 21st century farm policy look like? Let's put that forward and let's fight for it together. And in order to do that, you're going to have to break this unholy alliance. But that's what the American people want. They don't want Washington to continue in this broken manner that only rewards those that can hire lobbyists. And stopping that dynamic is necessary towards having the bold, positive ideas that people hunger for.
We have just a minute left in closing. The Speaker critiqued your organization. Would you be so bold as to give him some advice going into the new legislative year with the midterms ahead?
Well, look, I think that anybody in Congress, Republican, Democrat, otherwise, would be best served by putting forth bold ideas that show their values as a member of Congress. And I hope that the Speaker, I hope that everybody We'll look at some of these outside-the-box, positive, innovative ideas that are percolating around there, learn the lesson of what Mike Lee has shown in his time in Congress, and put forth big, bold ideas and tell the American people why they make America best.
Thank you for being here this week.
Thanks for having me.